Everyone can hear me okay? Fantastic. Good morning. My name is Arash Nasri. I'm a regulated investment consultant and head of corporate treasury for Cartwright. Cartwright is an investment consultancy business. We advise corporations, which is my area of focus, but also charities and pension schemes on their investment strategy. For corporations, we work with CEOs, CFOs, finance heads, heads of treasuries on how to manage their balance sheet assets, how they hold cash and other assets, and how they think about maybe more scarcer assets alongside their more traditional treasury. We advise on all asset classes, so that's equities, bonds, property, alternatives, gold, as well as Bitcoin. Bitcoin is just another asset class for us alongside some of the more traditional assets. Conversations we're having with clients increasingly touch on the topic of Bitcoin. The reason I'm here today, I wanted to talk about how that conversation around Bitcoin with institutions usually goes. They often have a consistent path. They usually start the same way, and they often stall at the same point. And it requires diligence and tenacity to continue and get to the end of that journey. This talk is about that pattern. It's not a Bitcoin pitch. It's a map of the journey, one that institutions actually go through when they start taking this asset seriously. By the end, hopefully, you'll recognize some of the stages, either within your own institutions or within your own way of thinking. Hopefully, it will give you a clearer sense of what it actually takes to move from the first question to an informed decision. The title of the talk is From Curiosity to Conviction, but the subtitle is also important to note. How institutions take the first step in assessing Bitcoin. This is not why you should own Bitcoin or how institutions should buy Bitcoin. It's the assessment of Bitcoin. That's what I'm keen to talk about today. Before I go any further, please take a moment to have a skim through the disclaimer. This is for informational purposes only, and for educational purposes. Crypto assets, as we all know, are high-risk investments. This is not investment advice. All clients are different and need different solutions and support. Please seek independent investment advice before any decisions. So here's the framework that I wanted to speak about. Every institution that has seriously engaged with Bitcoin, genuinely engaged, has gone through these 4 stages. They've gone through them in their own way and at their own pace, but the stages are fairly consistent. Curiosity, resistance, reframing, and decision. What's interesting is that most institutions don't fail to engage with Bitcoin because of the asset in and of itself. They stall, and many of them do stall, because of how these stages interact with the way institutions actually make decisions. Let's go through each one in turn. Curiosity. Stage 1 is curiosity. This is the trigger phase. The most important thing to know about curiosity is that it's almost never ideological. This isn't someone internal reading the Satoshi white paper, spending a few hundred hours on the history of money, and then becoming a maximalist and a believer. It often starts with some kind of externality, a question from the outside. One we often hear is client demand. A pension trustee might call their investment manager and say, my members are asking why we don't hold Bitcoin. What am I supposed to tell them? A simple but very good question. A CFO might get back from an industry conference where he or she is talking to peers, and the peers are speaking about investing in some of these scarce assets and Bitcoin. That CFO comes back to his treasury team and says, what are we missing here? Maybe it's performance. Bitcoin has obviously seen high returns alongside high volatility over the past decade. When something like that performs so well, it gets noticed in investment committees. Whether you want it to or not, it gets noticed. Or maybe it's the macro pressure, the fixed supply in an inflating world thesis. We've seen central bank balance sheets explode in recent years, and in fact in recent decades. For some treasurers and CIOs, that's prompted real questions about whether some of the traditional assets are really doing the job that they need. Then there's regulation. We're increasingly seeing regulatory clarity, and we now have a plethora of high-quality routes to access the asset. These triggers don't decide the outcome, they just start that assessment process. It's important to be clear on that one point. Curiosity is not enthusiasm. It's the beginning of the process, and that process might lead to some exposure, or it might lead to no exposure, and we'll come on to that a bit later. Stage 2 is resistance. Think of this as the immune system of the institution attacking anything new and unknown. This is the stage where most institutions go quiet or fall over. And here's the thing that I think most institutions often miss, or most people outside of institutions, I should say, often miss. Bitcoin doesn't arrive on the desk of one decision maker. It arrives simultaneously within 5 different departments. Each of them have a completely different set of priorities and concerns. Compliance will ask, is this allowed? Is it within our mandate? What does the regulator say? They are governance and permissions questions. Risk will say, what happens if it goes to zero? What's the tail risk? How do we model an asset with this kind of high volatility? They are risk management questions. Marketing will ask, and this is one of the most honest objections you'll hear, will this make us look unserious? Will our clients think that we've lost the plot? That's a reputational question, and for some investors, it's actually the most important one. Operations will ask, how do we hold this? What does custody look like? How do we reconcile this asset at month-end, at quarter-end valuations? They are all operational infrastructure questions. And last of all, the investment committee. They ask, what's the model? What role does this play in a portfolio, and what's the evidence? They are analytical and portfolio construction questions. 5 very different questions from 5 groups, importantly with different responsibilities and different things at stake. The reason institutions stall is because they can't answer these questions in one conversation. The compliance officer doesn't need to be persuaded that Bitcoin is a good investment. They need to know whether it's permissible. The risk manager doesn't need ideology, they need data. And none of them, very importantly, none of them are wrong to be asking any of these questions. It's interesting that institutions aren't objectively opposed to Bitcoin in many cases. They're using frameworks that they already know and trust, but it's to evaluate something that's unfamiliar to them. Stage 3 is reframing, and this is often the stage of a turning point. The slide says it pretty well. Bitcoin does not enter institutions as a revolution. It enters as an unfamiliar asset in a familiar framework. That framing is really important. These are some of the very, very many objections that come out as part of that previous resistance phase. And this is how they might be reframed as questions in order to make progress, considering that every institution will answer these questions differently. Volatility. The instinctive reaction is, it's far too volatile for us. But the real question the investment committee needs to answer is, how could a small allocation fit within our existing risk budget? How does it also compare to other high volatility, potentially high return assets? Think small cap equity or private equity. Custody risk. The instinct is we don't know how to hold this. The real question is, what custody and control frameworks are available to us? What are the regulated custodians now doing? What does direct on-chain ownership of a bearer asset look like for an institution? And what governance does it require? The crypto objection. Many institutions still conflate Bitcoin with the wider digital asset space. The reframe is simple. Which specific characteristics matter to you? As you've heard a few times before, Bitcoin has a fixed supply, over 15 years of on-chain transaction history, no CEO, no board that is controlling the asset, and no counterparty in the traditional sense. That's a fundamentally different profile than almost all other assets in the digital asset landscape. Correlation risk. The question isn't just, does Bitcoin go up when all other assets go down, and vice versa? It's more, how has it actually behaved in different environments and different economic situations? Risk on, risk off, inflationary, disinflationary. We now have enough data to model some of this better. And the binary framing. The instinct is we either own it or we don't, black or white. The reframe is what level of exposure, if any, can be justified. A carefully designed allocation to something that is genuinely uncorrelated is not necessarily a bet. It is a considered portfolio decision. Now, institutions, as you can see, will expect all of this to be evidenced, documented, discussed. Opinion alone will not move them, and shouting louder in these meetings and within these institutions will not make a difference. And that's absolutely right. Stage 4 then is decision. And I want to be precise here about what that means. I've paraphrased some Shakespeare. To allocate or not to allocate, that is the question. And I want to be clear that going through this process fully and properly might end up with an exposure of 0 to Bitcoin, and that's absolutely okay. It's not appropriate for everyone. It's not relevant for all portfolios. Your investment time frame might be too short. There are a number of reasons why Bitcoin might not be right for an institution right now. A 0 allocation might be appropriate. I've highlighted it there at the bottom. The point is it should be an actively decided 0 allocation and not a passively decided 0 allocation. There's a meaningful difference between an institution that has gone through this process, that has mapped its mandate, stress tested the various scenarios, understood the custody options, engaged compliance, engaged risk, and concluded that Bitcoin does not belong in their portfolio or their treasury right now, and an institution that simply hasn't looked at it. The first is conviction. Conviction that the answer is no, at least for now. That's a very legitimate outcome. The second is the absence of a decision. And in my experience, the second of those is riskier because it means that question will keep returning. Now, if one does decide to allocate, what does that look like? Maybe it's a limited position. Something small enough to learn from, but without having a material impact on the balance sheet. An access route that is consistent with your mandate. Maybe that's a small futures overlay within a tactical asset sleeve. Maybe it's a regulated fund as a starting point. It could be framed internally as exploratory exposure. We've done all the theory that we can do, now we need to learn in practice. And the documented rationale. This is an absolute non-negotiable for institutions. Not just because regulators require it in absolutely every case, but internal stakeholders do as well. Compliance needs a paper trail. Directors, trustees, C-suite executives need minutes, and risk need a policy. Without documentation, you're not making a decision, you're creating an exception. On the right, further down the road, maybe that pilot evolves into a more mature position. You've learned from the pilot, you've updated the risk model. Bitcoin now has a defined role in the portfolio or in the treasury with appropriate sizing. Stakeholders at this point begin to develop an even deeper understanding of the asset and its risks. It might end up being more holistically integrated. For corporations, for example, they're using it increasingly at point of sale. They're using it for cross-border payments to reduce costs and improve efficiency. Remember that there is more than just holding Bitcoin as an asset. For some institutions, it might mean moving deeper into custody. They might have started with futures, structured products, a regulated fund, and want to move into direct on-chain custody. The economics, the transparency, and the elimination of counterparty risk becomes increasingly attractive and compelling at scale. But like I said at the top of this slide, zero exposure might be the right answer for some. So I'm going to pause here and say something that might be slightly uncomfortable for some friends in the audience. Hopefully I won't lose any friends. This is a Bitcoin conference after all, and many of you are here because you already very strongly and truly believe in the asset. The arguments on the left-hand side here, ideology, sovereignty narratives, fix the money, fix the world, Austrian economics, the separation of money from state, maximalist conviction arguments. These arguments are reasons to hold Bitcoin. These arguments for holding Bitcoin are absolutely not wrong. For many in this room, these were the arguments that did matter and still do matter. They are arguments that were and still are genuinely compelling for early adopters, individual investors, and those that came to Bitcoin from a values or a social lens. These are entirely legitimate reasons to hold and support the asset. But there is a translation problem. These arguments are the right message, but to the wrong audience. These arguments on the left are not as important when you're sitting in front of institutional decision makers. The compliance officer does not care about sound money. They worry about breaching their regulatory permissions. The risk manager doesn't want a philosophy lecture. They want a volatility surface and a drawdown analysis. The CFO doesn't want to hear about the growth of M2. They want to know that Bitcoin has been stress tested against their cash flow requirements and that an auditor can sign off the asset cleanly and without issue. This is absolutely no criticism at all of Bitcoin advocates. It's just a recognition that institutions speak a different language. They speak about risk-adjusted returns, regulatory compliance. They talk about liquidity, custody risk, and reputational safety, importantly. The asset is exactly the same, but institutions are not satisfied by philosophy alone. They prefer to use frameworks that they know and already trust. So we're back to the journey overview, but now with a different observation. Most institutions that started this process got stuck somewhere between stages 2 and 3. They've had the trigger, they've encountered the internal resistance, the immune system attacking anything new and unknown. And they haven't yet managed to reframe the objections properly. We see this quite often. An institution will say, we've looked at Bitcoin. But what they mean is, someone in the investment team or the treasury team flagged it, compliance pushed back, and it got parked. That's not a considered view. That is a stalled process. The institutions that have moved through stage 3 into stage 4 ones that have reached a properly informed decision, whether that is a yes or a no, have done so because someone internally took ownership for the process, not just the investment case, but the compliance review, the operational readiness, the education, very importantly, the education, all of it. And so for my last slide, if you're working within an institution that is somewhere in this journey, or if you're part of one yourself, here are 3 ideas that might help you to move forward. Firstly, map your permissions, map your mandate, map your key decision makers. Before you can have the investment conversation, you need to have the governance discussion. Can we hold this legally and under our existing mandate? Who needs to sign it off? It's not just the CEO and it's not just the CIO. It's compliance, it's legal, it's trustees, and it's directors as relevant. What is the approval pathway? You'd be quite surprised about how often this basic mapping of who needs to decide when and how doesn't exist. An institution's first ask shouldn't be, should we own Bitcoin? It should be, what does it even take to own Bitcoin structurally? That question alone can often unlock this process. Second, model 100% loss and the upside scenarios. I mean this seriously, it's a very useful exercise. This was particularly useful when we advised the first UK defined benefit pension scheme to invest into Bitcoin. Model the full loss. What does 100% loss to the portfolio of that asset look like? If it's a 1% allocation, it's a 1% drawdown. That's well within the bounds of a normal drawdown for a somewhat balanced portfolio. Modeling it makes it real, and sometimes makes it seem more tolerable than you may have actually expected. Then model the upside. What does a material increase in price do to your portfolio? How resilient does it make your portfolio become? This is not about price prediction. This is about scenario analysis. We do this for every other asset class. Why shouldn't we do it for Bitcoin? And third, understand why others have made their decisions. And here again, I want to be specific. I'm not talking about the institutions that haven't allocated because they haven't looked at it. I'm talking about the institutions that have gone through all 4 stages of this journey and reached a decision. Some have allocated. Harvard University Endowment is a good example, one of the largest endowments in the world. Went through this process and at the start of 25, bought a modest 0.2-ish% allocation within their endowment. That's since grown to a larger number. Some have gone through this process and have allocated. Others have gone through this process, all stages 1 to 4, and have not allocated. Both of those outcomes are worth understanding. The institutions that have done this work have built something valuable. Regardless of where they have landed, they have a documented view. They have internal alignment, and very, very importantly, they won't get caught flat-footed by the next pricing cycle or the next round of client questions. The title of the talk was From Curiosity to Conviction. And that's what conviction actually means. Not that you're certain that the Bitcoin price will go up, not that you've become a Bitcoin maximalist. It means that you've done the work. You understand the asset well enough to make a defensible decision. And that decision, whether it is a yes or a no to some kind of exposure, should be fully informed and fully considered. And I'll leave you there unless we have any time for questions. Maybe we do. Get a microphone. Microphone? I'll repeat it maybe.
Thank you. Do institutions recognize already Bitcoin as an asset class? Since BlackRock, for example, does.
Yeah, a very good question. So the question was, do most institutions recognize Bitcoin as a separate asset class in its own right, in the same way we see it as Cartwright as its own top-level asset class? I would say that most institutions see it more as a component of an alternatives top-level asset class. So I think they see alternatives, there may be hedge funds, there may be gold, and then there may be digital assets within that. And then Bitcoin is probably a subset of digital assets. Again, it goes back to some of what we spoke about. A big educational piece needs to be done to clearly separate Bitcoin from the rest of the digital asset space. And to your point, I think it needs to be pushed to the top and the top level as a top level asset class. Oh, it seems, let's talk. Well, let's come and talk together. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.